34, verses 1 to 7. I will bless the Lord at all times. His praise shall continually be in my mouth. My soul shall make a boast in the Lord. The humble shall hear thereof and be glad. O magnify the Lord with me, and let us exalt his name together. I saw the Lord, and he heard me, and delivered me from all my fears. They looked upon him, and they were lightened, and their faces were not ashamed. This poor man cried, and the Lord heard him, and saved him out of all his troubles. The angels of the Lord encamp round about them that fear him. Let us bow our heads. Heavenly Father, we give you thanks and praise and glory. It is always wonderful when we can come before you and we can acknowledge you as our Lord and God. Father, even as the members of this honorable house, they're gathered here today to discuss the matters that is on the agenda. We pray, Heavenly Father, for your divine presence, for your guidance, for your leading. We invite you, Divine Spirit, to be here within this assembly this morning, that the matters that will be discussed, Heavenly Father, it will be done for the betterment of the people of this nation. We commit each one before you, and we pray that your divine presence will take control of the atmosphere through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Thank you, Chaplain. Good morning, members. You may be seated.
Confirmation of minutes. Minutes of proceedings of the 14th meeting of the 3rd session of the 12th Anguilla House of Assembly.
Are there any amendments to the minutes, please? If there are no amendments, can someone move that the minutes be accepted as circulated?
Madam Speaker, I rise to move.
Rise to move. Madam Speaker, I rise to second. It has been moved and seconded that the minutes of proceedings of the 14th meeting of the 3rd session of 12th Anguilla House of Assembly be accepted as circulated. Those in favor say aye. Those against say no. The ayes have it. Minutes of proceedings of the 14th meeting of the 3rd session of 12th Anguilla House of Assembly accepted as circulated.
Oath of allegiance to new members, Acting Attorney General.
I, Erica L.P. Edwards, do swear that I will be faithful and bear true allegiance to His Majesty King Charles III, his heirs and successors according to law. So help me God.
Announcements by the direction of the Speaker.
Thank you. I make apologies for the member for Valley South who's going to be late this morning. I see that the Deputy Governor has already made it, so I no longer need to make for you. Thank you.
Questions? None. Government statements on recent developments? None. Papers? None. Reports from committees? None. Petitions? None. Government notices? None. Private members' notices? None. Motions? None. Personal explanations? None. Other business, government business? A bill for Financial Services Commission Amendment Act 2023, second reading.
The Honorable Attorney General.
Madam Speaker, I move that the bill shortly entitled A Bill for Financial Services Commission Amendment Act 2023 be read a second time.
Madam Speaker, I second.
You may explain the merits and principles of the bill.
The objects and reasons for the bill. The bill for the Financial Services Commission Amendment Act 2023 introduces definitions for AML-CFT Supervisory Authority and Foreign AML-CFT Supervisory Authority. The bill also makes provision for the introduction of gateways for disclosure of information in the Financial Services Commission Act. These gateways mirror those found in the Proceeds of Crime Act. It also provides that the supervisory authority has the power to refuse to disclose information to a foreign AML-CFT supervisory authority in specified circumstances. Madam Speaker, I commend the bill and its contents for the consideration of the whole House.
It has been moved and seconded that a bill shortly entitled A Bill for Financial Services Commission Amendment Act 2023 be presented to this House. I now open the floor for contributions on this bill. Floor is open. If there are no contributions, then I invite the mover to respond, please.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, this piece of legislation is part of the suite of legislation that we need to get passed for the mutual evaluation for the Caribbean Financial Action Task Force evaluation that is currently on the way. Madam Speaker, I wish to add nothing further, and I commend the bill to this honorable House.
It has been moved and seconded that a bill shortly entitled A Bill for Financial Services Commission Amendment Act 2023 be read a second time. Those in favor, say aye. Those against, say no. The ayes have it. I call upon the clerk to read the bill a second time.
An act to amend the Financial Services Commission Act, RSA CF 28, to make provision in relation to any disclosure of information to a supervisory authority.
Under Rule 45 of the House of Assembly Rules of Procedure 2021, the bill now stands referred to a committee of the whole Assembly to be considered clause by clause. Assembly in committee.
Clauses 1 to 5.
That clauses 1 to 5 do stand part of the bill. Those in favor say aye. Those against say no. The ayes have it.
The title and the enacting clause.
I put the question that the title and the enacting clause do stand part of the bill. Those in favor say aye. Those against say no. The ayes have it. The Assembly will now resume its sitting. You may report.
Madam Speaker, I beg to report that the bill entitled Financial Services Amendment Act 2023 has passed through committee without amendment and is ready for its third reading.
A bill for Financial Services Commission Amendment Act 2023, third reading.
Madam Speaker, I move that the bill entitled Financial Services Commission Amendment Act 2023 be read a third time and passed.
Hold on 1 second.
Madam Speaker, I rise to second.
And seconded that a bill shortly entitled A Bill for Financial Services Commission Amendment Act 2023 be read a third time and passed. Those in favor say aye. Those against say no. The ayes have it. I call upon the clerk to read the bill a third time.
An act to amend the Financial Services Commission Act, RSACF 28, to make provision in relation to any disclosure of information to a supervisory authority.
Time and passed.
A bill for Trust Amendment Act 2023, second reading.
Madam Speaker, I move that the bill shortly entitled Trust Amendment Act 2023 be read a second time.
Madam Speaker, I second.
Thank you. You may explain.
Madam Speaker, the objects and reasons for the Trust Amendment Act 2023. The bill for the Trust Amendment Act 2023 makes provision for the maintenance of adequate, accurate, and up-to-date beneficial ownership information by trustees of a trust. The amendment also introduces the definition of beneficial owner. Madam Speaker, I commend the bill and its contents for consideration of the whole House.
I now invite debate on the merits and principles of the Trust Amendment Act 2023. Floor is open for contributions. If there are no contributions, I invite the mover to respond, please.
Sorry. Madam Speaker, I have nothing further to add, and I commend the bill to this honorable House.
Thank you. It has been moved and seconded that a bill shortly entitled A Bill for Trusts Amendment Act 2023 be read a second time. Those in favor say aye. Those against say no. The ayes have it. I call upon the clerk to read the bill a second time.
An act to amend the Trust Act, RSAC T70, to require trustees to keep records of beneficial owners of the trust.
Under Rule 45 of the House of Assembly Rules of Procedure 2021, the bill now stands referred to a committee of the whole House to be considered clause by clause. Assembly in committee.
Clauses 1 to 4.
I put the question that clauses 1 to 4 do stand part of the bill. Those in favor say aye. Those against say no. The ayes have it.
The title and the enacting clause.
I put the question that the title and the enacting clause do stand part of the bill. Those in favor say aye. Those against say no. The ayes have it. The Assembly will now resume its sitting. You may report.
Madam Speaker, I beg to report that the bill entitled Trust Amendment Act 2023 has passed through committee stage with no amendment and is ready to be read a third time.
A bill for Trust Amendment Act 2023, third reading.
Madam Speaker, I move that the bill titled Trust Amendment Act 2023 be read a third time and passed.
Madam Speaker, I second.
It has been moved and seconded that a bill shortly entitled A Bill for Trust Amendment Act 2023 be read a third time and passed. Those in favor say aye. Those against say no. The ayes have it. I call upon the clerk to read the bill a third time.
An act to amend the Trust Act, RSAC T70, to require trustees to keep records of beneficial owners of the trust.
Bill read a third time and passed.
A bill for Proceeds of Crime Amendment Act 2023, second reading.
Madam Speaker, I move that the bill entitled Proceeds of Crime Amendment Number 2 Act 2023 be read a second time.
Madam Speaker, I second.
Madam Speaker, the objects and reasons for the bill of the Proceeds of Crime Amendment Number 2 Act 2023 introduces the definition of a foreign AML CFT supervisory authority. This bill clarifies the power of a supervisory authority to disclose information to a foreign AML CFT supervisory authority. It also provides that the supervisory authority has the power to refuse to disclose information to a foreign AML CFT supervisory authority in specified circumstances. Madam Speaker, I commend the bill and its contents to for the consideration of the whole House.
Thank you, Member. It has been moved and seconded that a bill shortly entitled Proceeds of Crime Amendment Number 2 Act 2023 be considered by this House. I open the floor now for contributions. The Honorable Member for Island Harbor is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and good morning. It's a pleasure to be here in this honorable House today. I want to say good morning to you, Madam Speaker, the staff, members of the House, those in the gallery, and those listening and watching. Madam Speaker, on the 17th of July, it will be 3 years since you have started your second stint in this House, and today is 3 years exact since this administration has, started and continues the work for the people of Anguilla. And so I want to say congratulations to you and congratulations to the team. We also have a new acting governor, Madam Speaker. I would like to wish Mr. Paul Candler, Governor of Anguilla, His Excellency, the best for the time that he is here as we await our substantive governor, Ms. Julie Crouch. Madam Speaker, I know that we are going through a suite of bills here which are necessary to upgrade Anguilla's legislation and also to meet requirements that are imposed upon us by international bodies. In fact, the mutual evaluation, which is now ongoing, and the team is here from CFATF, Caribbean Financial Action Task Force, to look at our laws and how we handle issues such as anti-money laundering, combating financing of terrorism, and proliferation financing. And these are important, Madam Speaker, if we want to be players on the international stage in financial services. We have to have a good reputation. And we do know, Madam Speaker, that this Anguilla is blacklisted by the European Union, and is deemed non-compliant by the OECD. Now, someone may say, why is that important? That determines the reputation of a country, and potential investors and developers look at the status of a country to know if it is feasible for them to invest, Madam Speaker. Now, this act specifically, the amendment for the proceeds of crime, and the amendment to the Parent Act, essentially talks about the competent authorities. And it is important to define the competent authorities, especially the Foreign AML CFT Supervisory Authority, but it also talks about reporting and whether reporting can be refused. And certainly, we do have issues right now where there is the beneficial ownership and public registry, which has come up in all the different jurisdictions, and we're trying to get a final definition or a final decision on whether these have to be open, and it's necessary to go through these discussions. So today, we are going through this suite of bills, and just for the listening public, so they know that even though there is not robust debate and discussion, these are very important for the future of Anguilla in terms of the financial services as a pillar for the economy, for diversification, and that we can rely on. And as we go further through this House session and throughout this year and the years to come, we will have more legislation. We'll also have products that will be marketed to regionally and internationally, that would try to improve and increase our financial services. So I want to say that I have full support for this suite of legislation that is here, and there are a few more that are coming, Madam Speaker, so that we can meet the regulatory and compliance requirements imposed by international bodies to make sure that Anguilla meets the necessary standards. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Honorable Member. Are there any other contributions to this bill? If there are no other contributions, I invite the mover to respond, please.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you to the Honorable Premier for his contributions to the bill, and I have nothing further to add, Madam Speaker, and I commend this bill to the whole House.
Thank you, Honorable Member. It has been moved and seconded that a bill shortly entitled be now read a second time. Those in favor say aye. Those against say no. The ayes have it. I call upon the clerk to read the bill a second time.
An act to amend the Proceeds of Crime Act, RSAC P98.
Under Rule 45 of the House Assembly Rules of Procedure 2021, the bill now stands referred to a committee of the whole Assembly to be considered clause by clause. Assembly in committee.
Clauses 1 to 5.
I put the question that clauses 1 to 5 do stand part of the bill. Those in favor say aye. Those against say no. The ayes have it.
The title and the enacting clause.
I put the question that the title and the enacting clause do stand part of the bill. Those in favor say aye. Those against say no. The ayes have it. The Assembly will now resume its sitting. I invite the mover to report.
Madam Speaker, I beg to report that the bill entitled Proceeds of Crime Amendment Number 2 Act 2023 has passed through committee with no amendment and is ready to be read a third time.
A bill for Proceeds of Crime Amendment Number 2, Act 2023, third reading.
Madam Speaker, I beg to move that the bill titled Proceeds of Crime Amendment Number 2 Act 2023 be read a third time and passed.
Madam Speaker, I second.
It has been moved and seconded that a bill shortly entitled Proceeds of Crime Amendment Number 2 Act 2023 be now read a third time and passed. Those in favor, say aye. Those against, say no. The ayes have it. I call upon the clerk to read the bill a third time.
An act to amend the Proceeds of Crime Act, RSAC P98.
Bill read a third time and passed.
A bill for Financial Intelligence Unit Amendment Act 2023, second reading.
Madam Speaker, I move that the bill entitled Financial Intelligence Unit Amendment Act 2023 be read a second time.
Madam Speaker, I second.
Madam Speaker, the objects and reasons. The bill for the Financial Intelligence Unit Amendment Act 2023 provides that the director may enter into contracts or agreements with a foreign financial intelligence unit after the director has consulted with the Attorney General. The amendment also removes the requirement for approval to be given by the Attorney General before disclosure of any information received by the unit is made to any law enforcement agency in Anguilla. Madam Speaker, I commend the bill and its contents for consideration of the whole House.
Thank you. I now invite debate on the merits and principles of a bill for Financial Intelligence Unit Amendment Act 2023. Floor is open for contributions. If there are no contributions, I invite the mover to respond, please.
Madam Speaker, I wish to add nothing further, and I commend this bill to the Honorable House.
Thank you, member. It has been moved and seconded that a bill shortly entitled A Bill for Financial Intelligence Unit Amendment Act 2023 be now read a second time. Those in favor say aye. Those against say no. The ayes have it. I call upon the clerk to read the bill a second time.
An act to amend the Financial Intelligence Unit 2020.
Under Rule 45 of the House of Assembly Rules of Procedure 2021, the bill now stands referred to a committee of the whole Assembly to be considered clause by clause. Assembly in committee.
Clauses 1 to 4.
I put the question that clauses 1 to 4 do stand part of the bill. Those in favor say aye. Those against say no. The ayes have it.
The title and the enacting clause.
I put the question that the title and the enacting clause do stand part of the bill. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those against say no. The ayes have it. The Assembly will now resume its sitting. You may report.
Madam Speaker, I beg to report that the bill titled Financial Intelligence Unit Amendment Act 2023 has passed through committee with no amendment and is ready for its third reading.
A bill for Financial Intelligence Unit Amendment Act 2023, third reading.
Madam Speaker, I move that the bill entitled Financial Intelligence Unit Amendment Act 2023 be read a third time and passed.
A bill for Financial Intelligence Unit Amendment Act 2023, third reading. An act to amend the Financial Intelligence Unit Amendment Act 2023, third reading.
I put the question that the title and the enacting clause do stand part of the bill. Those in favor say aye. Those against say no. The ayes have it. The Assembly will now resume its sitting. You may report.
A bill for Financial Intelligence Unit Amendment Act 2023,
Madam Speaker, I rise to second.
Thank you, member. It has been moved and seconded that a bill shortly entitled Financial Intelligence Unit Amendment Act 2023 be now read a third time and passed. Those in favor say aye. Those against say no. The ayes have it. I call upon the clerk to read the bill a third time.
An act to amend the Financial Intelligence Unit Act 2020.
Bill read a third time and passed.
A bill for Digital Assets Business Act 2023, second reading.
Madam Speaker, I move that the bill shortly entitled Digital Assets Business Act 2023 be read a second time.
Madam Speaker, I rise to second.
Madam Speaker, the objects and reasons for this bill are as follows. Part 1 of the bill, clauses 1 and 2, provides for preliminary matters, including the interpretation, provision, and the meaning of fit and proper. Provision is made in Part 2 of the bill for the licensing of digital assets business. Clause 3 outlines what it means to carry on a digital asset business, being any of the activities specified in Section 4, subsection 2, are an activity specified by order by the governor under Section 3, subsection 3. Clause 4 provides for activities which constitute a digital asset business and makes it an offense for a person to carry on a digital asset business in Anguilla unless the person is licensed to do so. Clause 5 provides for the application procedure for a digital asset business license and the requirement to be met by the applicant in relation to each type of business. There are 5 types of license dependent on the activity to be undertaken. The clause empowers the Financial Services Commission to issue a license to a successful applicant. Depending on the type of license issued, various aspects of digital asset business activities could be authorized. Clause 6 provides for the procedure for the variation or change to a license. Clause 7 makes provision for the charging of annual fees in respect of licenses. Clauses 8 and 9 makes provision for the commission, that is the Financial Services Commission, to restrict a license where the licensee is not in compliance with the terms of the license. A license can either be restricted with notice or in the urgent cases without notice. Clause 10 sets out the circumstances in which a license may lapse, be surrendered, revoked, or suspended. Clause 11 makes it an offense for a person to hold itself out as a licensee unless the person has a license. Clause 12 makes it an offense for a person other than a licensee to provide to the public in Anguilla any type of digital asset business, whether in Anguilla or elsewhere. Clause 13 sets out the requirements for the issue of a prospectus in respect of the offer for sale of a digital asset to the public. A prospectus cannot be issued without the prior approval of the Commission and must satisfy all the requirements as set out in the schedule. It also provides protection to any person who acts on a prospectus which is found to contain misrepresentation or false information through a right of withdrawal and the payment of compensation. Clause 14 sets out the procedure in respect of where an amendment needs to be made to a prospectus. Clause 15 outlines the powers of the Commission in relation to a prospectus, including the waiving of certain information to be set out in the prospectus, and is empowered to order an assessment of the information provided, suspend or cancel an issue or offer made in relation to the prospectus. Part 4 of the bill outlines key obligations of the licensee and makes it an offense for the licensee to 1. carry on a business of providing any type of digital asset activity unless the licensee is has either a permanent place of business or a registered office in Anguilla. 2, failed to notify the Commission that the licensee is unable to meet the licensee's financial, statutory, contractual, or other obligations. 3, failed to comply with a notice from the Commission requiring specified information and reports relating to the licensee's business of providing a digital asset business. 4, fails to comply with the requirement to disclose to its customers information in respect of the keeping of their accounts. And 5, provide any type of digital asset business in Anguilla through an unlicensed agent. Clause 22 enables the additional regulation of a licensee that provides a digital payment token service, for example, in respect of the licensee's insurance against the risk of insolvency. Clauses 23 to 28 contain provisions relating to the monitoring and control of shareholding in a licensee. Clauses 29 to 32 contain provisions requiring the annual accounts of a licensee to be audited by an auditor appointed by the licensee. If the licensee fails to appoint an auditor, the Commission may appoint an auditor for the licensee, and the auditor would be empowered to examine on oath or affirmation any officer or employee of the licensee, and would be required to report to the Commission any matter which, in the auditor's opinion, constitutes an offense involving fraud or dishonesty. Clause 33 empowers the Commission to inspect the books of a digital asset business. Clause 34 empowers the Commission to conduct an investigation for specified purposes, for example, to ensure compliance with the legislation. Clause 35 makes provision for the confidentiality of inspection and investigation reports, and Clause 36 preserves the Commission's powers for inspection and investigation under the Financial Services Act. Clause 37 contains interpretation procedures. Where a digital asset business is unable to meet its obligations or an emergency exists in relation to that digital asset business, clauses 38 to 40 enable the Commission to perform various acts, for example, to assume control of and manage the digital asset business. By virtue of Clause 41, the Commission would cease to be in control of the business of the digital asset business when the Commission is satisfied that the reasons for the Commission's assumption of control of the business have ceased to exist. Clause 42 sets out the duties that are to be performed by the officers of a digital asset business during the period when the Commission is in control of that business, and Clause 43 makes provision in respect of remuneration and expenses of the Commission during that period. Miscellaneous provisions are provided for in Part 8 of the bill. Those are clauses 49 to 54. Madam Speaker, I commend the bill and its contents for consideration by the whole House.
Thank you, Honourable Member. I now invite debate on the merits and principles of the Digital Assets Business Act 2023. Floor is open for contributions. The member for Valley South is recognized.
Yes, Madam Speaker, I rise in support of this digital assets bill. I think that it's a welcome addition within Anguilla's context and in line with the global push to develop the legal and regulatory environments around digital assets. As we've seen over the past couple of years, Madam Speaker, there has been quite a push and a rise of interest around digital assets, and that's not to get confused with specifically crypto assets, as many people may believe that we're speaking specifically to crypto assets, as they are used interchangeably in some occasions. But digital assets, as captured within this bill, do formulate a wider ambit which includes digital payment tokens, but in our context does not include utility tokens, which would be covered under the Auto Act, which would have been passed in this assembly last year. Madam Speaker, just to maybe provide some context in relation to the discussion we're having around digital assets, a lot of people are very confused about the regimes around digital assets, and that's quite understandable because the regime is still developing and there's very differing contexts in different jurisdictions. And these contexts extend to considering what exactly is the substance of a digital asset, what constitutes a digital asset. Are we looking at the form of the digital assets or just its contents? What are the legal rights that arise from the use of digital assets? That is, do we then start to treat digital assets or cryptocurrencies as property, as they do in Singapore? And therefore, if we treat them as property, do they then have the arising responsibilities? What is considered control? What is considered possession? Who is considered to have title? And then how do we deal with the legal consequences of treating digital assets as of various forms? So in Singapore, Madam Speaker, the ICC treat cryptocurrencies as property. But that's not to say that that's a general perspective that is applied across the board in all jurisdictions. And so, Madam Speaker, what really comes to bear here this morning as we bring this digital assets bill before this House of Assembly is Anguilla is taking steps towards keeping up with the trend towards regulating these digital assets. We know that blockchain and blockchain technology is supposed to operate outside the ambit of being monitored or regulated for a very specific purpose, that it allows them to use the technology to benefit from anonymity, to have quick transactions, but there's also a cost side to the speed of transactions. I know a lot of people may have known of this. There's a gentleman who would have had a wallet, a Bitcoin wallet, which would have had about 50 million Bitcoin in it that he lost the password to. And he has no access to this wallet any longer. But I say that just in the context of these are very new technologies, Madam Speaker, and therefore we do have a responsibility to understand how we regulate it, what is the harm caused by not regulating, which we understand why the regulatory bodies are concerned. We've seen the troubles, I'll say, within the digital markets over the last 2 years. And I think that this is a very good step forward in terms of regulating digital assets and ensuring that Anguilla is protected in terms of what we do and how we protect users and the companies that actually offer these asset tokens. So thank you. I've just rise in support of this bill. Thank you.
Thank you, Honorable Member. Are there any other contributions? If there are no other contributions, I invite the mover to respond, please.
Thank you to the Honorable Minister for your comments and your support of the bill. Madam Speaker, I wish to add nothing further, and I commend the bill to this House.
Thank you, Honorable Member. It has been moved and seconded that a bill shortly entitled Digital Assets Business Act 2023 be now read a second time. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those against say no. The ayes have it. I call upon the clerk to read the bill a second time.
An act to provide for the licensing and regulation of persons carrying on digital asset business, the supervision of digital asset business, and connected matters.
Under Rule 45 of the House of Assembly Rules of Procedure 2021, the bill now stands referred to a committee of the whole Assembly to be considered clause by clause. Assembly in committee.
Clause 1.
Madam Speaker, I propose that in relation to Clause 1, it be amended as follows: by deleting the definition of court and substituting it with the following. Court means the High Court unless the context states otherwise. 2, by inserting the following definition in the appropriate alphabetical order. Digital asset exchange means a digital market exchange place or facility which provides for bringing together users on a regular basis for the purpose of the pairing and trading of digital assets against other listed digital assets or money, and sets rules for the execution of such transactions or for the negotiation or conclusion of such pairing and trading. 3, in the definition of digital assets, by deleting the paragraph subsection 3, the phrase as defined in the Anguilla Utility Token Offering Act. 4, in the definition of digital asset business, by amending paragraphs 3, 4, 5, 7, by deleting the word virtual wherever it occurs and substituting it with the word digital. 5, by deleting the definition digital custodial wallet services and substituting it with the following definition. Digital custodial wallet services means provision of the services of storing or maintaining digital assets or digital wallets on behalf of a client for the purposes of trading, exchange, or payment, but does not include client-managed facilities provided by regulated banking institutions or trust accounts provided by a regulated general trust company. 6, in the definition of digital asset services provider, by deleting paragraph E and substituting it with the following. E, participation in and provision of financial services related to the issuer's offer or sale of a digital asset. 7, in the definition of digital asset services vendor, by deleting paragraph A1 and substituting it with the following. 1, manages the digital assets on behalf of another person. 8, in the definition of digital payment token, by deleting the phrase as defined in the Anguilla Utility Token Offering Act wherever it occurs. 9, in the definition of special purpose depository services, by deleting paragraphs A and B. 10, by deleting the definition of utility token and substituting it with the following. Utility token has the same meaning assigned to it in the Anguilla Utility Token Act. 11, subsection 2, paragraph C2, by deleting 5% and substituting it with 20%. B, section 3, subsection 1, by inserting the word business immediately after the word asset where it occurs a second time. C, in section 4, subsection 2A, by deleting the word issuing. D, in section 4, subsection 2C, by deleting the word and wherever it occurs and substituting it with the phrase a digital asset. And E, in section 49(2), by inserting a new paragraph or immediately after paragraph N or classes of licenses. Madam Chair.
I put the question that clause 1 be amended as presented and do stand part of the bill. Those in favor say aye. Those against say no. The ayes have it.
Clauses 2 to 26.
I put the question that clauses 2 to 26 do stand part of the bill. Those in favor say aye. Those against say no. The ayes have it.
Clauses 27 to 54.
I put the question that clauses 27 to 54 do stand part of the bill. Those in favor say aye. Those against, say no. The ayes have it.
Schedule 1.
I put the question that Schedule 1 do stand part of the bill. Those in favor, say aye. Aye. Those against, say no. The ayes have it.
The title and the enacting clause.
I put the question that the title and the enacting clause do stand part of the bill. Those in favor, say aye. Aye. Those against, say no. The ayes have it. The Assembly will now resume its sitting. You may report.
Madam Speaker, I beg to report that the bill entitled Digital Asset Business Act 2023 has passed through committee with one amendment and is now ready for its third read.
A bill for Digital Assets Business Act 2023, third reading.
Madam Speaker, I move that the bill entitled Digital Asset Business Act 2023 be read a third time and passed.
Madam Speaker, I rise to second.
It has been moved and seconded that a bill shortly entitled A Bill for Digital Assets Business Act 2022 be now read a third time and passed. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those against say no. The ayes have it. I call upon the clerk to read the bill a third time.
An act to provide for the licensing and regulation of persons carrying on digital asset business, the supervision of digital asset business, and connected matters.
Bill read a third time and passed.
A bill for Goods and Services Tax Amendment Act 2023, first reading.
The honorable member for Island Harbor is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I rise to beg that a bill for Goods and Service Tax Amendment Act 2023 be read a first time.
Madam Speaker, I rise to second.
It has been moved and seconded that a bill shortly entitled Goods and Service Tax Amendment Act 2023 be read a first time. Those in favor say aye. Those against, say no. The ayes have it. I call upon the clerk to read the bill a first time.
An act to amend the Goods and Services Tax Act 2021, Act number 18, 2021.
Bill read a first time.
A bill for Goods and Services Tax Amendment Act 2023, second reading.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I rise to beg that a bill shortly entitled A Bill for Goods and Service Tax Amendment Act 2023 be read a second time.
Madam Speaker, I rise to second.
Thank you. Madam Speaker, I wish to state the objects and reasons for this amendment to the Goods and Service Tax Act. This bill seeks to amend the Goods and Service Tax Act to make the current exemption on the supply of fuel in Anguilla, specifically gasoline, diesel, and liquid propane gas, permanent. Previously, the supply of fuel was exempt from the goods and service tax for a period of 1 year from the 1st of July 2022 to the 30th of June 2023. Madam Speaker, with the goods and service tax, which the first phase was implemented on the 1st of October 2019, and then the second phase implemented on the 1st of July 2022. It was decided at that time, Madam Speaker, in order to keep down the price of gasoline, diesel, and liquid propane gas for cooking, especially given the international scene where there was a war in Ukraine, which caused the prices to increase, the supply chain causing prices, and then, of course, the oil-producing countries limiting their supply keeping the price up. It was felt that as a responsible administration, to do whatever we could to keep down the price of fuel. What this led to, Madam Speaker, is we also implemented removing the excise tax from gasoline, and with that, a price control. Madam Speaker, we certainly believe in free market and that the prices should be dependent on the free market, but sometimes you have to, by legislation, force things to happen. I say that because I will get back to that, Madam Speaker. But I just want to inform this House and the people of Anguilla that by not imposing the goods and service tax on gasoline, diesel, and liquid propane gas or cooking gas, the revenue loss has been 7.4 million EC dollars from the 1st of July 2022 until now, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I say that because whenever there's a revenue loss, this has to be made up somewhere. You either have to cut expenditure, which usually means this includes essential services, such as health and education, or you have to limit output. And so, Madam Speaker, there have been many statements made about cutting the GST rate from 13% to less than that. Madam Speaker, we put a 13% GST rate when it was proposed to be 17%. The IGT was already 9%, Madam Speaker, which was imposed long before we came to administration. And so you have a 4% raise from the 9% IGT to 13%. Now, if you cut the rate, Madam Speaker, then you'd have to limit the exemptions. And here we are, Madam Speaker, where this GST Act has exemptions for GST on fuel, gas, diesel, cooking gas, on healthcare services, on education services, on water services from the Water Corporation of Anguilla. 130 kilowatt hours per month of electricity with no GST, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, there are other exemptions. There's zero rating on essential food items. And so there's a lot of discussion out there, Madam Speaker, that we should not be putting GST on other services. But the fact of the matter, Madam Speaker, as I just said, that to start removing GST from items means that there's less revenue, and when there's less revenue, then there has to be less expenditure. And that expenditure is going to go towards what do we cut, Madam Speaker? I'm sure everybody has their own thoughts about what should be cut. But I can assure you that given all the thought and deliberations that go into the budgeting process, and where sacrifices have to be made, that to make any cuts would have considerable harm. And that is something, Madam Speaker, that we have to be cognizant of. So those who are not in administration, in the hot seat per se, can make all kinds of statements about there should be no GST on this. Why'd you have it on that? But Madam Speaker, as I said, when you have to make decisions for the people of Anguilla and to make sure that this country functions and you can provide services such as education and health care and other services which are beneficial to the people of Anguilla, including giving free health care in the public service to those who are 70 years and older, making sure that we can complete the new Albina Lake Hodge Comprehensive School, making sure that we can build classrooms at the Vivian Vanderpool Primary School. Madam Speaker, there are lots of needs. These are not wants. These are not desires. These are needs, Madam Speaker. And so it's easy to sit on the outside and say, cut this, decrease the rate. But then, Madam Speaker, we have to then get in there and deliberate what else can you do. And then we look at the MTEF, the Medium-Term Economic and Fiscal Plan, which was submitted to the United Kingdom, and it has certain policies in there. Some were there before we came, some that we worked on, and those have to be paid for, and there's a revenue attached, and then you have a certain subset of people say they don't want this. Anguilla doesn't need that. But then, Madam Speaker, how do you take care of the people? And how do you then satisfy the administering power? Because there are certain guidelines which you have to follow. There are provisions in MOUs that we met and some that we signed that we have to be held accountable for. So that's where we're at, Madam Speaker. So $7.4 million revenue loss through having no GST on gas, diesel, and cooking gas. But further to that, Madam Speaker, there's no excise tax on gasoline. And that used to be $1.59 per gallon. We put that in place in April of 2022, Madam Speaker. And Madam Speaker, the loss on that is $4.24 million. That is revenue loss, Madam Speaker, that we have to account for and make up. You can't come up with a policy without having the ability to fund it. And if you have a loss, you then have to make a cut that reflects that loss. And Madam Speaker, we extended the removal of excise tax on gasoline until December of this year, and that is projected to be another loss of $2.12 million. So if you think about it, that is $4.4 million plus $2.1 million. That's over $6 million that is given up in revenue just from removing the excise tax on gasoline, and $7.4 million up to this point that is given up. And if you project till December, so that'd be another 6 months, a half of that 7.4 is another 3-point-something million dollars. Madam Speaker, that is, a lot of revenue that is being given up to ensure that the people of Anguilla, that we reduce the cost of living, because we keep down the cost of fuel. By so doing, we also keep down the cost of electricity, because Anglec uses diesel to make the electricity. So that's the reason why we want to continue to remove the GST from gas, diesel, and cooking gas. We continue to remove the excise tax from gas at the pump. And Madam Speaker, this has required, as I said, maximum fuel price orders or price control on fuel. And it may be necessary, Madam Speaker, given the way things are with the high price of food in the supermarket, that we have to make similar plans. The Consumer Protection Unit is being worked on right now, consumer protection legislation, price control legislation, and then we may, Madam Speaker, have to loosen or remove moratoriums on certain businesses so that there is increased competition, hoping to force down the cost of food in Anguilla. Because they are zero-rated items, Madam Speaker. And it has to be shown that this zero rating on the GST is reflected in the price. And so far, Madam Speaker, we are not anecdotally convinced that this is the case. So we appeal to the supermarkets and the hardwares to be considerate of the people of Anguilla and not have to force the hand of government to get involved in price control, legislation, monitoring of food prices, and the price of other essential items, Madam Speaker. So I commend this to the whole House for consideration to remove the sunset clause, because in the Act, this would have expired today, Madam Speaker. We'd like to continue it so that we can continue to keep down the price of these essential items, fuel, for the people of Anguilla. Thank you.
Thank you, Honorable Member. I now invite debate on the merits and principles of this bill. The floor is open for contribution. The Honorable Member for Valley South, is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I want to rise in support of this bill for the removal of GST on our fuel, cooking oil, and other fuel supplies. As was stated, Madam Speaker, in 2022, that the GST bill is going to be under constant review by this administration. The Premier would have stated that when we're looking at removing or adding items or supplementing, generally across legislation, we have to do an exercise which looks at when we can make these decisions, what's going to be the cost of the decision? Is there a policy attached to that decision that has to be made? There's a process that takes place before we can come to the point of reaching to this honorable House and stating that we've made the decision of removing a particular item from a particular bill. And I say that to also provide some context for the people of Anguilla in relation to other reviews happening in relation to this bill, this Goods and Services bill, to indicate that one of the reviews that this administration is undertaking in relation to the Goods and Services tax is in relation to the application of the Goods and Services tax to cultural events. And like I said, Madam Speaker, we will be going through the process of reviewing, and when we come to the policy decision, taking it to Executive Council, and then moving forward to this honorable House for consideration. But I also want to state, Madam Speaker, because I've also heard some conversations about the Goods and Services tax and its necessity, because some persons still feel as though, there's some persons you speak to who still feel as though the Goods and Services tax bill wasn't a necessity for this island. And I can understand, Madam Speaker, some of their concern or their confusion, because there are some people who, while on one hand saying that the Goods and Services tax was unnecessary, they on the same hand say that the banking resolution was a complete necessity for this island. So I want to quote my colleague on the other side who said correlation is not causation and causation is not correlation. But in this case, there is direct causation. And there is direct causation when the debt ratio that you acquire is unsustainable, and you therefore have no ability to borrow or to make expenditure decisions. And therefore, you then are asked by your regional, international, and local bodies, when you make a decision, how are you going to fund or afford that decision? And the response, the direct response, is the implication and the implementation of a tax. And I know that certain persons are tired of the conversation around the banking resolution, Madam Speaker, because it seems to have gone on forever. But I say that only to provide the context that when the banking resolution was passed, there was a grace period of 5 years. And that 5 years or 4 years, I think it was 5 years, that grace period for the payment of the banking resolution, okay, that grace period for the payment of the banking resolution, Madam Speaker, would have led Anguilla right up to 2021. And I was looking through my documents to see if I could source the payment schedule that would have required Anguilla paying a specific amount of millions of dollars per year as the grace period had expired. Now, if the grace period was not 5 years, let's say, for instance, Madam Speaker, the grace period was 2 years, you would have had the goods and service tax a lot sooner. A lot sooner. Or you'd have had some tax measure a lot sooner. And that there is direct causation. Because if you have a manageable and sustainable amount of debt, and you don't need to raise further revenue to meet those obligations, whether international or regional or local, then there is no need to implement a tax measure. But if Anguilla has a debt amount of almost $500 million, and you come in and you're saying, well, how do you discharge this debt? And we looked across the world, because you have a very direct example in the United States. The United States was reaching their debt ceiling. And the question for their Congress was, what do we do now? Because if we default on our debt, there's a cascading effect across all world markets. And so you ask, what does Anguilla have to do with that? There is an implication to defaults on debt. I mean, the local man knows it. If you go to the bank and you have debt outstanding and you don't pay your debt, there is a consequence. And so, Madam Speaker, I only wanted to place some of that context because I don't want to belabor the point, really. But I do, at some point, want to bring you the schedule of payments that were due once that grace period was expired, so you have the data that proves what I'm saying. And I will try to get that for you at the next sitting of the House of Assembly. And so, Madam Speaker, although we are here and we're looking at removing a sunset clause from the inclusion of fuel in the goods and services tax, and although we're saying to you, Madam Speaker, that we're going to be reviewing the substances captured under the goods and services tax, which, Madam Speaker, any administration in power, when you've implemented a new piece of legislation, there is a period with which you have to work out the kinks. Because we know it's not a perfect science. We know the Attorney General's Chambers has a slew of legislation which it has responsibility for, and while we do our best to ensure that the legislation as it comes to the House is as perfect as possible, we still sometimes have to make amendments on the floor, and this is typical all over the world when you're dealing with amendments to legislation. But at the same time, we are going through the review and we've committed to go through the review of the legislation to ensure that where we see or where there's a possibility of us being able to make the change, and I say being able to make the change because there is a process, we will do so. So I just want to reiterate my support for this amendment to the goods and service tax to remove the sunset clause from the application of GST to fuel, and to thank the Honorable Premier for bringing this legislation to the House.
Thank you, Honorable Member. The Honorable Single Island Wide Electoral District Member, Mr. Joseph Vanterpool, is recognized.
Good morning, and thank you, Madam Speaker. Good morning to all of my fellow members in the House, those sitting in the gallery, as well as those following the proceedings online or via radio. Madam Speaker, I'll try to be brief today in my representations. First and foremost, I rise in support of this bill before the House today in terms of the removal of the sunset clause for GST on fuel. In fact, Madam Speaker, when we would have discussed the passage of this bill in 2022, I recall the members of the opposition were stating that we should have made it permanent then. I respect the Premier's views that they want to monitor and then react, but nonetheless, I commend the fact that we stand here today to remove the sunset clause, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, the cost of living in Anguilla is something that I've noticed has been a growing trend of discussion, whether via social media, whether in the communities, whether just running into constituents and having a chat. In fact, this morning, Madam Speaker, I would have stopped at the gas station and I had a constituent come up to me and would have told me, why it is that I hear that are you going to the House of Assembly today to put GST on gas? And I had to reassure her that that was not the case. In fact, Madam Speaker, I would have had to have a number of those conversations over the past few days. And I guess that's no fault for the members of the community, Madam Speaker. I think that that means it's upon us to do a better job communicating our message to constituents, I guess in ample time before coming to this honorable house so that it is clear what we are coming to this house to do when we do arrive, Madam Speaker. As the Honorable Premier would have indicated, there would be a loss of revenue for not have charging GST on fuel up until this point to the tune of about $7.4 million, Madam Speaker. And yes, we do have to weigh out the pros and cons when it comes to making exemptions to see, is it worth furthering exempting this going forward? What is the revenue loss that stood to be gained by not charging GST for the remainder of the year, which I believe was estimated at about $4.4 million for the rest of the year? And we then have to ask, that's a $4.4 million hit to government's revenue, but what are the implications of such? When people go to the pumps, the prices are no longer higher. As the Premier would have indicated, Anglic's electricity generation is predominantly dependent on the buying of diesel, somewhat to the tune of, I believe, over $200,000 was it a day or a month? I can't recall the numbers offhand, Madam Speaker. But had GST been charged on fuel, that would have been an immediate surge in the price of buying fuel for Anglic, which would have then have to been passed on to the consumers, which I remind us all, Madam Speaker, we are all consumers. Every person living in Anguilla, every business, every school would have all felt it, which means that the prices within the grocery stores and all operations would have had no choice but to react in the same way and increase. So with this being said, Madam Speaker, and understanding that it's not just a $4.4 million hit to government's revenue, but it's preventing those onward ramifications which would have undoubtedly increased the cost of living is why we are here today. So while we're in the spirit of discussing exemptions and weighing out the pros and cons, Madam Speaker, I would also like to make a suggestion that could further decrease the cost of gas at the pumps, would further decrease the cost of fuel for the persons on island, and thus that of the groceries, that of Anglic, etc., as we've already seen the interconnected ties, Madam Speaker. And that would be for us to consider repealing the bulk fuel tax, which we would have passed in 2021, Madam Speaker. For those who may not have recalled, the bulk fuel tax would have seen government's revenue, which would have been obtained from the two fuel providers on island, go from an annual fuel revenue of $100,000, which you can work out to be $50,000 per fuel provider, to 1.5 million EC dollars per annum, which then works out to $750,000 per fuel provider, Madam Speaker. When we had that debate, I recall it was quite spirited, and the Premier would have assured us, Madam Speaker, that there were discussions which took place with the fuel providers at the time to ensure that the people of Anguilla would not see any increased fuel prices from such a tax being passed. However, Madam Speaker, in actuality and reality, we saw that that was not the case. I can also recall, Madam Speaker, not only did the fuel prices increase, there was also a letter that was provided by at least one of the fuel providers on island, Madam Speaker, to indicate that they had no choice but to respond with increased prices to the demands of the bulk fuel tax, which was passed. So, Madam Speaker, we have seen exemptions so far of tax losses of $7.4 million so far for GST, with an additional $4.4 million to come. We've seen excise tax of $2.2 million exempted, and all with good cause, Madam Speaker. We should not be touching fuel in a way that will cause further hardship to the people of Anguilla. But if we can further repeal that tax, it's just $1.5 million more, Madam Speaker. We don't have to discuss whether or not this will impact the people of Anguilla by lowering prices, because we've seen what the passage of it has done. And this is another example of correlation may not be causation, Madam Speaker, but here we can see the direct correlation. And having seen the direct correlation, I think that considering all and with what the Premier highlighted, the reasons why we cannot at the current time look at adjusting the rate, this might be a means without adjusting the rate that will cause further savings and a reduction to the cost of living for the people of Anguilla, which I think should be considered, Madam Speaker. The final point I'd like to touch on, Madam Speaker. Well, before I get to that, Madam Speaker. No, the final point I'd like to touch on, Madam Speaker. The Premier would have indicated that the government is currently considering implementing cost protection mechanisms as it pertains to fuel, and indicated that they may have to consider doing such as well as it pertains to the supermarkets. And I'm not saying that that's either the right way or wrong way, Madam Speaker. When it comes to economics, there are several schools of thought. One of my favorites and one of those that I'm guided by is the school of thought that was written by Adam Smith, the father of economics, where he believes and he advocates for the free market, even though government should be the ones responsible for setting up the framework for that market. And he believes that the market will also always be guided by that invisible hand, which will lead it to the most effective and efficient way of operating. And to give some practical concerns, Madam Speaker, for those who may not be well-versed in Smith's readings, here's a practical example. If we were to put price control, government were to legislate that a can of tuna cannot be sold in stores for more than $5, let's say, Madam Speaker, then someone who's importing a can of tuna might bring it in at $1.50. They may pay 50 cents government tax. Their first cost is $2 and sell it at $3, Madam Speaker. They can sell it at $3, they can sell it at $4, they can sell it at $4.99. However, they cannot sell it beyond $5. So now, government would have set a cap to which the margin within competition can take place. Smith's reasons for advocating against such a model, Madam Speaker, especially in our context, where we are affected by a lot of shocks over which we have no control, Madam Speaker. We would have seen during the COVID pandemic, there were surges in price and shipping that we had nothing to do but deal with. We could not react to it in a way to keep it down, Madam Speaker. So should another situation like that happen and tuna go up to $3.50, well, it's now $4.25 for them to come, and now they have to play with that 75% margin between $5 for competition to take place. But should there be a shortage in the supply of tuna, should aluminum go up for the packaging, should something happen to cause a shortage in shipping, and the first cost of tuna now goes up to $5.50, Madam Speaker, or even $5. The person bringing it in pays the $5. They then get, say, $1 tax. Now it's worth $6, but due to legislation, they are not able to sell it beyond $5, which means they would either have to sell it at $5 and assume the loss of $1, or government will have to respond in a manner that's quick enough to keep up with the market, Madam Speaker. And Madam Speaker, let's be realistic. Or the item will stop being supplied within the market. Simple as that, because no one is going to bring in an item to sell it at a loss. So, Madam Speaker, with that being said, unless we have mechanisms in which we are really and quickly reactive, which again takes resources, Madam Speaker, to be able to police and administer, there are significant concerns about simply implementing price control in the form of price caps. And if we were to now take this tuna example, Madam Speaker, to that of gasoline, if a similar situation were to happen and for some reason we were not able to respond quickly enough, and that would cause a missed opportunity for us to get the supply of fuel either at an affordable rate or within reasonable time, that could ultimately lead to blackouts. That's just a reality, Madam Speaker. I'm not saying that that's going to be the case, and it's definitely not something I wish on Anguilla. So I am an advocate for government intervening and setting up certain measures to control the market. But rather than price control by setting a fixed rate, Madam Speaker, I am one who would advocate for price margins or profit margins, caps on profit margins. So, and with that being said, Madam Speaker, rather than setting a fixed cap to the price, you can then say, okay, we acknowledge that the market fluctuates with certain prices and that we have no control over that, but on certain items you are restricted to a certain profit margin. So you're not able to bring in a can of tuna and then sell it for 400 times profit by buying it for 3 and selling it at 12, Madam Speaker. So there are mechanisms by which government can get involved in the market and help to regulate it to control the cost of living. And with that being said, Madam Speaker, that's why I said I hope that government, when it comes to instating this, will go through widespread consultation as to the manner which is appropriate for our context in Anguilla, Madam Speaker. So that being said, once again,
On a point
give
of
my
order,
full
Madam
support.
Speaker, just before the member completes his debate, can he clarify whether he's speaking about price control on fuel, which already exists, or price control on groceries, which was what the honourable member from District 1 was proposing as a future action? Just a clarification. Thank you.
Thank you, Member. Through you, Madam Speaker. For clarification, I was referencing the Premier's comment about the potential intent to enact price control within the supermarkets as well. So then I was just giving some context as to why I feel that we should be cautious as to our approach as to how we implement price control in Anguilla, given Smith's perspectives in economics. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, Honourable Member. Are there any other contributions? The member for Valley North is recognized.
Good morning, Madam Speaker. Good morning to the members of this honorable House, those in the gallery, those watching via Facebook Live or listening via radio. Madam Speaker, I rise in support of this amendment that should have been made permanent from inception, given the actions of this government, Madam Speaker, as it relates to fuel prices in Anguilla. Madam Speaker, I wish to remind the general public of a few things. Upon coming to office in 2020, this administration increased a host of fees on some of the most essential services across this island, Madam Speaker. But one of the most impactful was the petroleum tax of $750,000 on each fuel supplier on island. $1.5 million per year in total, Madam Speaker. Imagine paying a combined taxes of about $100 and something thousand, and then all of a sudden paying $750,000 annually, Madam Speaker. But you know what's worse than that, Madam Speaker? The tax was implemented mid-year, and the suppliers were charged the full $750,000, which means then, Madam Speaker, they had to pass on that full 1 year of taxes in a 6-month period to the consumer so that the tax could be passed on, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, this only, of course, hurts the end consumer. Imagine, Madam Speaker, the fuel companies were the ones advocating for the people. Imagine, Madam Speaker, all of this happening when fuel prices are rising globally, prices are volatile, Madam Speaker. Imagine the fuel companies are the ones advocating for the people. The ones saying, don't make it retroactive, Madam Speaker.
On a point of clarity, the fuel companies was advocating for the consumer. Can you clarify that?
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The fuel companies were the ones saying, don't make it retroactive. Start from mid-year, Madam Speaker, or even start from the next financial period, Madam Speaker. So therefore, in my view, Madam Speaker, in my humble opinion, they were the ones advocating on our behalf, Madam Speaker.
Can you point to when and where this?
Is there a point of order? A point of order is a breach of the rule. Please, do not interrupt the member.
Thank you very much for that, Madam Speaker. The one saying don't make it retroactive, just start from the mid-year, or better yet, start from the next financial year. Again, Madam Speaker, all this while fuel prices globally are rising. Imagine telling your people that you're putting Anguilla first, but in the same breath, Madam Speaker, you're increasing the fuel tax by 600 and something thousand EC dollars a supplier. These are the facts, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, higher fuel prices affect everything. They affect everything within the economy. It affects the cost of doing business. It affects the cost of running our homes. It affects the cost of getting to school, work, groceries, everything, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, the reality is simply this. Since this government has come into office, in my humble opinion, the average citizen's purchasing power has drastically decreased, Madam Speaker. My humble opinion. This was never really about the people, you see, Madam Speaker. And let me give you some clear examples of why. Since 2001, when the second phase of GST was passed with the assistance of the DG and the AG, who were not elected by the people, it was established that there would be a temporary inflationary period if a viable solution was not established for the stock on hand. The government had an entire year, Madam Speaker, to come up with a viable alternative to dealing with the stock on hand instead of just passing on that inflation to the consumer. And they did not come up with anything viable, Madam Speaker, until a few days before GST was supposed to start in July of 2022, Madam Speaker. A few days before, after pressure from the business community, Madam Speaker, pressure from the people generally, June 2022, the businesses were promised an IGT credit. And I have to put this into context, Madam Speaker, because this administration would have you believe that they have been honestly looking out for the interests of the people. So I have to put everything into perspective, Madam Speaker. July 2022, the businesses were promised an IGT credit. July 2022, July 18th, the businesses were given a deadline, Madam Speaker, by which they had to submit all of their information as it related to the stock on hand. A totally unrealistic expectation of the business community. That was later, Madam Speaker, extended to August 31st, 2022, thankfully. So there was pressure on the businesses to make sure they submit the information on the stock on hand. However, on the government side, there was no robust, there was no aggression to try to make sure that in turn, government could establish a framework whereby those businesses could ensure that they completely understood what it entailed in terms of receiving this IGT credit back, therefore reducing the temporary inflationary period for people, Madam Speaker. So again, we go back to the timeline, Madam Speaker. August 31st, which, Madam Speaker, I don't think this is funny, but August 31st, Madam Speaker, I go back to August 31st. The businesses needed to submit their information as it relates to stock on hand, Madam Speaker. So they did. 11 of them did so, Madam Speaker. Some of them didn't even receive confirmation of receipt of it from the necessary body, Madam Speaker, but they did. September, nothing. October, nothing. November, Madam Speaker, nothing. Crickets. Crickets for 3 months. While the hospitality industry stayed at home during their off period, Madam Speaker, dealing with the effects of high inflationary prices, Madam Speaker, that were a direct result of this administration's implementation of GST. A temporary inflationary period that they admitted would happen, that they knew would happen, Madam Speaker, simply because the tax was being implemented. So therefore, Madam Speaker, the temporary inflationary period is happening. We move into December. We come to the House of Assembly. We tell all our people Merry Christmas, Happy New Year. We don't expect to come back, Madam Speaker. And then all of a sudden, we're told we will need to come back to the House of Assembly on the 29th. On December 23rd, Madam Speaker, the business community received a letter from the PS Finance indicating, Madam Speaker, that in order to receive the IGT credits by the end of the year, they would have to submit certain pieces of documentation, and they were then given all of the information that really should have been given, Madam Speaker, in June, July, or August, so that the people could benefit from the removal of that 9% IGT, so that there could be a reduction, Madam Speaker, in that temporary inflationary period that our people were facing, Madam Speaker. Never happened. So this is now the 23rd, which is a Friday, by the way, Madam Speaker. December 23rd, the businesses who are now preparing for Christmas sales, who are now in the thick of things, saying, if you want to receive those credits, please let us know if you passed on those savings and provide us with the information to do so at that hour, Madam Speaker. So this is Friday, the last business day before the Christmas rush. Then you have Saturday, which is the 24th. The 25th is Sunday. Monday is a holiday for the 25th, and Tuesday is another holiday for Boxing Day. And of course, the submission must be submitted by the 27th, the first business day after. Does that sound to you, Madam Speaker, like an administration that cared about giving genuine relief to the people, Madam Speaker? That doesn't sound like that to me, Madam Speaker. Perhaps we can interpret it differently, but it doesn't to me. But the people will decide, Madam Speaker, not me. I am just providing the people with a reminder of the events that transpired, because that, Madam Speaker, removing that 9% and that old stock on hand, that year's worth of old stock on hand, would have provided the average citizen with temporary relief of that temporary inflationary period that was only happening as a direct result of the implementation of the tax. Yes, there was general inflation happening globally and all of this, Madam Speaker, but that temporary inflationary period was as a direct result of the tax being implemented and government deciding we don't want to take a loss, so therefore the consumer has to be the one that has to endure that temporary inflationary period. Madam Speaker, in a climate where government is asking citizens to make sacrifices, and I've heard the honorable member for Island Harbor indicate that, we have to make sacrifices. We have to be willing partners in order to get Anguilla where it needs to go. And I agree with that, Madam Speaker. I agree that we all need to be making sacrifices. So imagine, Madam Speaker, my shock when I read an Executive Council minute of 8th June. And let me just let you know who all was present, Madam Speaker. The Honorable Premier and Minister of Finance, the Honorable Minister of Social Development, the Honorable Minister of Home Affairs, the Honorable Minister of Sustainability, Madam Speaker, and then of course, the Parliamentary Secretary as well, Madam Speaker, I think would have been there, just to provide some context of the people who would have been present. So imagine my surprise this week, Madam Speaker, when I'm reading through the Executive Council minutes. And I quote, instructed the Attorney General's chambers to draft legislation to amend the PSSTRA Act to provide for the reversal of column 3 in respect to parliamentarians, in addition of full constituency and entertainment allowances with commencement at a date of entry into force of the legislation. Madam Speaker, for the members of the general public who may not be aware of this, a number of years ago, there was some salary cuts made to parliamentarians, to members of the civil service in 2 different periods, Madam Speaker, okay? And now, Madam Speaker, there is a suggestion being made, Madam Speaker, for some of these to be reinstated, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I don't know if this administration is tone deaf or willful. How can you consider raising salaries and reinstating allowances for parliamentarians and ministers and the Speaker in a climate such as this? If we are going to do so remarkably well, Madam Speaker, with GST and all of these things, Madam Speaker, then why don't we reduce the burden on our people? Reduce the GST rate, Madam Speaker. Maybe increase the list of items being exempted. Maybe remove freight from some aspects of the GST. No. Let's increase our own salaries, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I support this amendment, and I strongly encourage the government of Anguilla to disregard the 3rd row of the phased approach to reinstate salaries for ministers of government, elected members of the House of Assembly, and the Speaker. The combined amount for 2003 and 2024 is around 750,000 coincidentally. And all this comes, Madam Speaker, directly from the Executive Council minute. I'm not making up these figures, Madam Speaker. I'd suggest reducing the petroleum tax by half and abandoning the unconscionable plan to further inflate the salaries of ministers. I want to put on record that the opposition was never consulted, Madam Speaker, on these increases, nor do we agree with them. As a matter of fact, we grossly believe that it is unconscionable and a slap in the face of citizens that are struggling to make ends meet on a daily basis, Madam Speaker. That is the reality. Let us stick, Madam Speaker, to the members of the public service and reinstating some of their salaries and coming up with a set plan and system to do so, Madam Speaker. There is absolutely no reason, Madam Speaker, for these salaries to be reinstated for ministers, parliamentarians, or the Speaker of the House. And that is my humble opinion, Madam Speaker. I think it is absolutely unconscionable in this particular climate. I heard, Madam Speaker, earlier mention being made by the Honorable Member for Island Harbour that, there may be a move to remove some of the restrictions on having certain businesses in Anguilla operate. So open things back up again, Madam Speaker. I want to put on record, Madam Speaker, that that will only serve to hurt local businesses in this country because, Madam Speaker, the Premier might not be aware, but I can guarantee you that most businesses in this country are barely keeping their head above water, Madam Speaker. These are the facts. These businesses have major liquidity issues, Madam Speaker. They are holding on by a thread. One particular business alone, Madam Speaker, pays out 45,000 EC dollars monthly on just the salaries of their staff, Madam Speaker. And unfortunately, Madam Speaker, they are not recouping the type of money that is necessary to even allow them, Madam Speaker, to turn a profit. Now, I know some members have already said, oh, well, if the businesses don't make a profit, they'll close down and they'll move on. I've heard those before, Madam Speaker. But the reality is that the business community, Madam Speaker, especially small businesses, are the engines of this economy. They are the ones that you go to for support, Madam Speaker, for your social programs, for your community-based programs. These are the same people that you've been tapping into for decades, Madam Speaker. So lifting those restrictions, Madam Speaker, won't make things more competitive. It will mean that some people cannot compete at all. So what it will mean is that some of the local businesses will have to close their doors, Madam Speaker, because they cannot turn a profit. In some cases, they will not even be able to break even, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, we talk about the banking resolution and all of these things, but to date, I still cannot hear a viable alternative that is detailed by this administration as it relates to the banking resolution. But, Madam Speaker, in the same breath, you're praising the strength and the health of the bank. That is as a direct result of said banking resolution. As a direct result of that banking resolution, we have a strong, successful bank, a bank that is lending, a bank that, Madam Speaker, I have been blessed to be the recipient, and other members of this House have been blessed to be the recipient of mortgages, Madam Speaker. A healthy bank, Madam Speaker. Many other young Anguillians across the island, Madam Speaker, have been able to benefit from the quote-unquote healthy bank that members have talked about publicly, Madam Speaker. And as a result of that, Madam Speaker, investments could be being made in this country. Construction is happening, Madam Speaker, as a direct result of the lending of the same institution, Madam Speaker. So, Madam Speaker, if the banking resolution was bad, then we shouldn't be praising the success of the bank at this time, Madam Speaker, because it doesn't make any sense. And then before coming into office, GST was the worst thing in the world. It would destroy Anguilla and destroy the economy. And there was a promise to come up with viable alternatives, which did not materialize, Madam Speaker, at all. Never materialized. But all of a sudden now, Madam Speaker, GST is able to fund so much and do so much for us. Why is that, Madam Speaker, compared to prior to being voted into office? But the reality is, Madam Speaker, ultimately, the people will decide. Not me, Madam Speaker. The people will decide. I only have one vote. But the people in Anguilla will decide ultimately whether they truly believe that this administration, since 2020 to now, has truly had their best interests at heart, or they've had their own. And there are many examples of this, Madam Speaker. So again, Madam Speaker, I indicate that I rise to support this amendment because I believe that any relief given to our people is much needed relief, Madam Speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Member. Are there any other contributions to this bill? The Single Island Wide Electoral District Member, Mr. Kyle Hodge, is recognized.
Madam Speaker, thank you, and good morning to the House, good morning to the gallery, and good morning to the people of Anguilla. Madam Speaker, today before us is an amendment to the Goods and Services Tax Act 2023. An amendment, Madam Speaker, to permanently remove GST from fuel at the pump, known as gasoline and diesel, and then liquid propane gas. A very necessary step for the government to make at this time. And I applaud them for at least realizing that as it relates to fuel, Madam Speaker, that the cost is already high and the burden will be too great for the people of Anguilla to bear had they allowed the exemption to expire. Madam Speaker, I can recall when I was a part of the administration and we were going back and forth with the issue when it became clear that the administration had chosen the path of GST. I was one, Madam Speaker, who championed many of the zero-rated and exempted items. And that is before the act was passed, and even also after the passage of the GST Act in 2021. So even though, Madam Speaker, I strongly opposed and continue to oppose, I remember going to every meeting, every GST meeting, with the consultants, with the permanent secretaries, and everybody. I remember going to those meetings, and the members of the administration can attest to this. I went to those meetings with a list of all of the zero-rated items in Sinkits and Nevis, and another list of all of the exempted sectors from the same Sinkits and Nevis. And on that list, Madam Speaker, was, of course, gasoline and diesel and liquid propane gas. So fuel, Madam Speaker, is a commodity that can easily and quickly impact the cost of living and doing business. And this is a commodity, Madam Speaker, that we don't produce. And therefore, we have no control over the cost of it like many other countries. Fuel is very volatile. It's a very volatile commodity. But in addition to it being very volatile, it is already taxed in Anguilla, which is also why I was fighting for it not to be included. But somehow it ended up being in the act. The fact of the matter, Madam Speaker, is this administration, like the member for Valley North would have said, also levied a bulk fuel tax of $750,000. And I believe that was US. Was it US? EC, sorry. And they levied this tax, $750,000 EC annually, on major importers, namely Delta and Sal. But in addition to that, there's already a 4 cents per liter of excise tax, which is now waived until December. But there's also a 1% customs service fee also levied at the port. And then there's another 40 cents per liter in import customs duty that is also levied at the port. This still has nothing to do with the fees levied by ASPO, port handling fees, container fees. Those are also levied on fuel at the port. So the question is, how many times can you tax the same commodity? Madam Speaker, that's the facts of the situation. These are the current taxes on fuel, even before they reach to the pump. And together, Madam Speaker, when you bring back in the excise tax, it adds up to at least 4 EC dollars or thereabout per gallon that government directly receives for gas, for fuel. And Madam Speaker, everybody got a car, everybody got a vehicle to drive. So the people of Anguilla are paying these taxes. The fisher folk are also paying these taxes. So when I hear people say that we're not paying taxes in Anguilla, that is false. That is a lie. And the truth is, Madam Speaker, that all these taxes, all this cost goes into the pricing of fuel and the end consumer. The end consumer bears the burden. The end consumer pays it all. So I was surprised, Madam Speaker, that fuel made it to the GST Act. But I commend the government now for realizing that it should be removed permanently. Madam Speaker, the Premier quoted some revenue loss figures. And to be honest, I don't always, Madam Speaker, believe in those numbers. Because sometimes, Madam Speaker, just sometimes, when you reduce a tax, you end up collecting more revenue. So to be sticking to figures and saying that when I remove this particular tax, the government loses X amount of millions of dollars, it's not always necessarily true. Because sometimes, by decreasing a tax, the people of Anguilla, consumers, consume more. And the fact of the matter is, the price of fuel is higher. So the other taxes that are in place can always make up for that loss. So there are a lot of factors that we need to take into consideration before we throw out numbers in the millions to scare people or to intimidate people or to make people believe that this is the amount of money you're losing.
Madam Speaker,
Yeah.
I'd ask the member is impugning my character.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So I'm going to ask you to retract the statement.
Which statement?
The statement that you made last.
Can you refresh me on that statement?
Intimidating.
Okay, I
Throw out
retract
numbers
the
to
word
intimidate.
Yeah,
Yes.
okay. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Yes.
But Madam Speaker, I'm sorry, I got a little passionate, Premier. But Madam Speaker, while it is good and easy for the government to remove the GST from fuel and propane gas, there's an issue that is being ignored, and that is the fact that accommodation tax was replaced by GST. And I raise the issue, Madam Speaker, because it is GST related, and it is a real concern. So in essence, Madam Speaker, what is happening since the introduction of the goods and services tax, the accommodation tax paid to hotels, instead of going directly to government, is now lumped with the other GST taxes, and is collectively, Madam Speaker, it goes into a GST pool to be paid to government. But before the GST is collected by the hotel, but before the GST that is collected by the hotel is paid to government, Madam Speaker, whatever GST that hotel would have expended, that is subtracted from the total that is collected by the hotel, and that total includes accommodation tax. Madam Speaker, The fact is, this weakens the collection of GST from the hospitality sector in a major way. And I'll tell you why, Madam Speaker. And government is aware of this issue, because I'll quote now from an Executive Council minute that says, accommodation tax was revenue received with no mechanism for claiming inputs, whereas GST, such claims by hotels are possible, and the impact on revenue performance has to be monitored, meaning this sector is now paying less tax. That is a quote from an Executive Council minute. Those are not my words, and I'm not paraphrasing. This is directly from Executive Council. So what is the outcome from the monitoring? Was it monitored? And if it was monitored, Madam Speaker, then the people of Anguilla deserves a report. But we have yet to hear whether or not it was monitored. So through you, Madam Speaker, if the Premier can address that Executive Council minute that spoke to the concern that they had as it relates to accommodation tax being replaced by GST. What is the findings? What are the findings? What is the outcome of that monitoring?
Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I'd like to ask through you the member, what's the date of this Executive Council minute? Is this a minute that would have been made public, knowing that Executive Council minutes are confidential unless they are the ones made available to the public? And why, Madam Speaker, would similar statements have been made by the father of the member on the radio some months past? Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Madam Speaker, thank you. The leader of government business and the member for District 1 seems to forget that Executive Council minutes are posted on government site. It is posted. You can go to government site and find this exact minute.
Madam Speaker, I did ask specifically the date of that, and if this was a minute that would have been made public, or is it one that he would have had access to if he was an Executive Council at that time, or this is a confidential minute, because there are certain minutes that belong to Executive Council and there's some that are made public, Madam Speaker. I'm just asking for clarification.
Madam Speaker, it was made public. I don't have the date, but it was made public, and I can share it. Probably before this House sitting is finished, I'll have that date for you, and I'll share, so that we can also update the general public. But moving on, Madam Speaker, I have spoken to many business people and trades, men and women, and I want to suggest, Madam Speaker, sticking to the topic of GST, I want to use the opportunity to suggest that the government look into the issue where in some sectors, only the bigger or more established businesses, our tradesmen and women, are forced to charge GST, while in the same sector, the smaller, more informal businesses, smaller tradespeople, perhaps they are just doing it as a hobby or maybe a side hustle. They are not necessarily registering or have the ability or capacity to register. And for example, mechanic shops, you would have mechanics to the side of the street that are not charging GST. You would have mechanics driving around and doing little side jobs. They are not charging GST. But the more established entities, because they have brick and mortar, because they are known as mechanic shops, they have to charge GST. So if this is something that the administration can look into to make the situation more fairer, it definitely would be appreciated. So, just generally speaking, Madam Speaker, I would advise that I would advise the government to exempt sectors where there are inconsistencies as it relates to everybody in that sector being on board with GST. Madam Speaker, I hope that my contribution and suggestions do not fall on deaf ears, because the truth is, I would rather be using my time to find alternatives to GST than to be here to be making suggestions to tweak this tax. But this is the path that the government chose for the people of Anguilla. And as they say, it can't be removed. But I am from a different school of thought, Madam Speaker, and anything can change with the right people and with the right circumstances. Because, Madam Speaker, accommodation tax was also an act that was written in law. The environmental levy was also a tax that was written in law, and so too was communication tax. And, Madam Speaker, we know that all of those taxes were replaced and repealed. So, in essence, what I'm saying is, if you put the work in, and if you feel enough for your people, and if you respect your people enough, you'll be creative enough to convince the British, and any act can be repealed once you have the right alternatives. And Madam Speaker, just before I close, the Premier would have sent an indirect threat to the retailers of Anguilla when he mentioned that he's considering, if prices on the shelves does not decrease, that he's considering lifting a moratorium that will allow more businesses in the retail sector, specifically supermarkets and hardwares, to open up. Madam Speaker, let me remind the member for District 1, the reason for the moratorium in which he agreed to back then when it was being implemented was to protect local and indigenous businesses. And I'll say this, Madam Speaker, before I sit. It is a dangerous thing to allow those sectors, especially our food sector, to be controlled by one group of people. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, Honorable Member. Are there any other contributions? The Honorable Member for Sandy Hill is recognized.
Good morning, Madam Speaker. Oh, good afternoon, Madam Speaker. Good afternoon to the members of this honorable House and to members of the listening public. Madam Speaker, I rise in relation to the Goods and Service Tax Amendment Act 2023. And in particular, Madam Speaker, this Amendment Act to the GST is to remove the possibility of fuel being charged by GST. And in fact, the objects and reasons says this bill seeks to amend the Goods and Services Tax Act to make the current exemption on the supply of fuel in Anguilla, specifically gasoline, diesel, and liquid propane gas, permanent. Now, Madam Speaker, as a bit of a backdrop, and you would have heard the members, certainly the members of opposition who have spoken already, indicate and remind the public that when the Goods and Services Tax was implemented in 2002, it included, 2022, I said 2002. 2022, it included the GST on fuel. And at the time, the government of Anguilla would have recognized the negative impacts of the GST on fuel and would have passed temporary exemptions, which were renewed from time to time. Now, the members of the opposition, Madam Speaker, from inception had proposed to this government that the fuel be removed from GST from the beginning. And so it is good to see that today, on the 30th of June 2023, we are now before this honorable House to remove fuel from GST. And the reason why the members of the opposition had opposed.
Madam Speaker, point of clarification. There has been no GST on fuel since the inception. This is just to remove the clause where it can start tomorrow. We are making it permanent. So I'm just asking that the public be not misled, Madam Speaker. Thank you.
Thank you.
Madam Speaker, I object to the use of the term misled because the law, until this act is passed today, requires that GST be charged on fuel. It is the exemptions that have been passed which would have overridden the implementation of that act. But today, this the law remained on its books. The law is still on the books with respect to GST, and it is only today that a provision is being made to remove it from the GST.
The point of order is referring to what the member for Eastern is saying. On several times this has expired and has been renewed through the Executive Council. What we're doing today is making it permanent. So you don't have to go to Executive Council and continue to renew it time and time again. So the Executive Council had the power and authority to continue to renew this every time its expiration was approaching, which was we were doing over the last period of time.
Madam Speaker, there's nothing that I've heard in the points of orders raised which suggests that GST was not charged on fuel based on the law.
Well, there was an exemption, it was not.
It is in the law.
But there is an exemption.
If
law.
we can find the GST Act, is fuel, does GST apply to fuel in the law? I'm not asking about exemptions. The Act that is in existence today for GST, does it include fuel, yes or no?
But the exemption overrides that.
Madam Speaker?
One law hinges on the next.
Madam Speaker?
Simple as that. It's the same thing with the rules.
Madam Speaker, there's nothing that I've said that is incorrect. The law provides for GST to apply to fuel. That's it. The existing law. That's something else. The law that was passed in July 2022 by this administration provided that GST will apply to fuel. There is nothing that I've said that is wrong in that statement. And I challenge any of the members of the government to bring the act and show me where fuel is not in that act. And until that is done, Madam Speaker, I will continue with my statement. As I was saying, Madam Speaker, from inception, the members of opposition had advocated that fuel be removed from GST, from the GST Act. And so I am happy today to see that this amendment that is coming to the House removes the fuel from the GST Act permanently. There are no longer, once this act is passed, there will no longer be exemptions that applied from time to time to the law. And so, Madam Speaker, when the opposition advocated that fuel be removed from the GST Act as it was passed in July of 2022, it was based on a number of considerations. The first being that even before the implementation of the Goods and Services Tax Act wholesale by this administration, this government passed the bulk fuel petroleum levy and increased the cost of petroleum, the levy, by 700%. And I want to say, Madam Speaker, that that levy was set out in medium-term economic plans for 5 years before. It was listed. There was never any law that went to Executive Council. And there was never any law on the petroleum levy to increase by 700% that was brought to this Honorable House before this government put it into effect. And the reason why it stayed where it was and was never progressed was because there was a discussion and advanced steps being taken to ensure that if such a tax was added, that the suppliers would not be able to pass it on to the average consumer, to the average Anguillan, to each and every individual. When this government brought it to the House, I specifically recall standing and raising an objection on the passage of this petroleum levy, the increase by over 700%, for it not to be passed unless and until provisions had been made to ensure that it was not passed on to the people of Anguilla. And I can specifically recall the member for Island Harbor, the leader of government business, responding and stating that they were in discussions with the fuel suppliers and with a view to ensuring that it was not passed on to the public. And you have heard the member for Valley North stand and give a detailed recollection as to what took place at that time. And so I won't go into it again because you've heard it in this Honorable House. But what I would say, Madam Speaker, is the reality is that there was ultimately no determination and no decision made where the suppliers would be able to absorb that without passing it on to the consumer. And so, when the suppliers passed it on to the consumer, to the average Anguillan, the cost of electricity would have increased. Then you added GST onto it, which only compounded the problem. And so, the basis of the objections at that time were included the negative impacts of COVID in 2022, and many of us can recall that when the GST bill was passed in July of 2022, we were still suffering from the after effects. There was still a high rate of unemployment in the country. Because of the inflation as a result of shortage of supplies, there was a supply chain issues, there was the high price of foods, and not just in Anguilla, but in the outer world outside of Anguilla that impacted the cost of goods here in Anguilla. And so for all of those reasons, shipping issues, and the resulting inflation as a result of difficulty in obtaining goods throughout the world, and other factors, as a result of all of those considerations, we stood in this Honorable House and we asked for the GST not to be implemented. And it wasn't just us, Madam Speaker. It was a cross-section of the Anguillan public through protests and marches, and a march that took place, which would have ultimately fallen on deaf ears as this administration would have moved forward on the implementation of GST and for it to become effective in July of 2022. And so, Madam Speaker, the government of Anguilla, having recognized the high cost of living, the high rate of inflation, and the difficulties that people were experiencing here in Anguilla, notwithstanding the fact that they passed the GST, would have implemented a number of steps, short-term steps, supposedly to ease the burden on the people of Anguilla. One of those would have been an EC $1,000 stimulus for payment on domestic electricity accounts. There was also stimulus in relation to the elderly, food vouchers at the grocery stores, and the exemption of essential food items from GST. All temporary measures, Madam Speaker, which were intended to ease the burden of the high cost of living and inflation on the people of Anguilla. But also very temporary, Madam Speaker, because after the stimulus packages and after the exemptions will come to an end, the GST and the impact of GST would be felt by the people of Anguilla. And so when I saw the Executive Council minute from the 8th of June 2023, and the member for Valley North would have outlined the persons who were present. Dr. Ellis Webster as Minister of Finance, Economic Development, Investment and Health, Honorable Minister for Social Development, Cultural Affairs, Youth Affairs, Gender Affairs, Education and Library Services, Ms. Deanne Kentish-Rogers, Honorable Minister for Home Affairs, Immigration, Labor, Human Rights, Constitutional Affairs, Information and Broadcasting, Lands and Physical Planning, Mr. Kenneth Hodge, Honorable Minister for Sustainability, Innovation and Environment, Mrs. Quincy Gums Marie, Honorable Parliamentary Secretary, Mr. Merrick Richardson, and absent would have been the Honorable Minister for Infrastructure, Communications, Utilities, Housing and Tourism, Mr. Hayden Hughes. And of course, there would be no explanation as to his absence from Executive Council on that day. But, Madam Speaker, this EXCO minute of the 8th of June 2023, just a few weeks ago, we're still in the month of June, would have set out a number of interesting factors that I think that it's important. It's uploaded on the Government of Anguilla website. And I would encourage persons to take a read of it when they have the opportunity. And on page 2 makes reference to cost of living support, exemptions from customs duties and tax for essential items. And Madam Speaker, it says that Council removed the duty and tax on items to make them more affordable for consumers from April 2022 to October 31st, 2022, and then extended to December 2022. And it was further extended until the exemption with respect to the IC, the import customs duties and interim goods tax, was extended until March 31st, 2023. And then on June 30th, due to continuing inflationary pressures, it is proposed to extend to December 31st, 2023. And Madam Speaker, this exemption from customs duties and tax for essential items has also been advocated for removal by the members of the opposition. And we hope that at some point in time, this government will take heed to that request being made and bring, similar to the fuel, bring a piece of legislation forward to ensure that the customs duty and tax for essential items, the exemption remains in place permanently. Or certainly that the essential items be removed from duties, the respective duties. And what is interesting, Madam Speaker, is that in this EXCO minute, it speaks about the revenue collection between the period of April of 2022 and May of 2023. And it says that, based on the calculations, based on the figures provided, that there is an overperformance of EC $64 million, which will adequately support the proposed measure, which is to extend the exemption and customs duty and tax for essential items until December 31st, 2023. $64 million overperformance of revenue between April 2022 and May 2023. Now, I am sure that the average Anguillian cannot contemplate what EC $64 million would look like. I can't. And so you are talking about the implementation of GST, and between April of 2022 and May of 2023, you can talk about EC $64 million over performance. And I've heard the members of the government from time to time, in fact, on the last press conference, they bragged about the GST, or they certainly spoke about it. and the advisor to the